are you ready to go and talk about Jack Kirby and comic books and GoBots and Fantastic Four?
For sure, yeah, let's do it.
Yo, welcome to my Summer Lair. I'm your host, Sammy Stanley. Never gave me a nickname, Younan. And welcome comic book writer and artist Tom Scioli, based in Pittsburgh. Two of his recent projects recognize and explore the fantastic imagination of Jack King Kirby. The first project is Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics, which is an outstanding Jack Kirby biography / graphic novel that in some ways mirrors Captain America's origins. You know, scrappy kid, born in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. He draws well. I think people often forget Steve Rogers was a commercial artist for a time. Yes, I'm aware he's not a real person. He gets drafted, fights in World War II, and comes home victorious. Only when he returns to comic books, Jack Kirby was successful, though not always victorious. It's difficult to calibrate an authentic Jack Kirby opinion. He mined his rich imagination and gifted us so many stunning visuals and enduring characters. The rich soil of the Marvel Universe, from which we decades later would happily harvest as the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Kirby was a major contributor to all of that. But he was also work for hire, which was standard at the time, even though what Simon and Kirby, and especially Lee and Kirby, were doing was not standard. Which brings us to the second Tom Scioli project, related to Jack Kirby, the Fantastic Four Grand Design. As Tom astutely writes in the first issue, the history of the Fantastic Four is the history of the Marvel Universe. Like the X-Men Grand Design that preceded it, Fantastic Four Grand Design is a seamless blending of decades of Fantastic Four continuity into one long, astonishing story that, yes, tells the history of the Marvel Universe. Fantastic Four introduced us to Black Panther, Inhumans, and so many other characters, including a giant world eater and his silver assistant with a surfboard. So like the Challengers of the Unknown, another Jack Kirby creation, let's cannonball into these excellent projects with comic book writer and artist and super duper nerd, Tom Scioli. Yeah, so I want to start off with what is Total Recall Show? I want to start there because an interview is a lot like Total Recall Show, like an episode, right? Where you kind of look back. So I'm going to be looking back at some of your stuff, at your career. So for anybody that doesn't know, what is Total Recall Show?
It's a YouTube show that I do with my friend Matt Zioli, and we talk about pretty much whatever we feel like talking about. So it's a lot of nostalgia, a lot of stuff from like the 80s and 90s, movies, TV, occasionally comic books. But yeah, it's really, you know, the sort of conversations that like I haven't had in a long time. Just everybody being so isolated, and it was just kind of nice to just do, just those kind of like nerdy kind of deep dive kind of conversations that are kind of hard to have these days. So that's been it.
You like recent episodes were like Mr. T. You guys had another one about the debate between like the Sam Raimi Spider-Man versus the James Cameron Spider-Man. Like those are the type of nerdy conversations like you're talking about.
Yeah, and like one of the recurring themes is like whenever possible we try to find like old, like early drafts of scripts for like those kind of movies like Batman or Spider-Man or Star Wars or whatever, and then compare those like first draft or like early drafts with the finished product to kind of see get a little insight into the creative process and like how it got to what it is. And that's been really interesting, just seeing kind of how much is there from early on, and then how much is kind of like sort of out of focus and not quite there yet.
Yeah, I think the James Cameron Spider-Man would have been really interesting. I don't know how it would have connected with fans. I don't know if it would have worked as what we read on the page, but as a concept, it would have been really interesting to have that out in the world.
Yeah, it would have been like very much of its time too. Like
Yeah.
we missed out on getting sort of like an 80s or 90s kind of Spider-Man movie, and that would be interesting, sort of like with a little bit of like the Terminator gloss,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
So I want to switch now from something I guess lowbrow like a James Cameron Spider-Man to something highbrow. So
Yeah,
congratulations, because Fantastic Four Grand Design made the NPR Books 2020 list. That's really classy.
yeah, thanks. Yeah, that was a really pleasant surprise.
So tell me then, what is it with these guys from Pittsburgh and these Grand Design books?
Yeah, I mean, Ed Piskor, who's also from Pittsburgh,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, he did the X-Men one, and then when Marvel was looking, for like other artists to do other brand designs, they thought of me, and it seems like there's almost developing like a Pittsburgh school of comic arts, like a kind of we're all pretty different, but there does seem to be some connective tissue. There does seem to be like a somewhat unified philosophy about comics, and it just sort of, I think, happened, pretty organically.
We see that in like Portland, for example, with like guys like Brubaker and Bendis. They do a lot of crime. I know Bendis hasn't done a lot of crime generally lately, but there's a lot of
Yeah,
crime, a lot of dirtiness, like dirty characters, dirty people doing dirty things. We see some overlap,
yeah,
and that's what you're talking about with like
it
Pittsburgh.
is interesting.
Hmm.
Yeah, it is interesting how these things, pop up because, like, yeah, I'm accustomed to sort of looking at these things from the outside, sort of seeing like, oh yeah, there's that group and there's that group, of creators who are sort of like-minded. But it's interesting to actually be in that and not almost not even aware that that's what's happening, and then having like other people point it out to me, and then kind of having to look at like my own work and like the work of my friends from an outsider's view and be like, okay, I could see that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the grand design, right?
Right. Yeah.
So, for anybody that doesn't know, how are you describing Fantastic Four Grand Design? Like, do you consider it like a hip hop remix, or
Uh,
how do you tell people what it is? Because people know what Fantastic Four is, but what is the Fantastic Four Grand Design?
the Fantastic Four Grand Design was sort of like, I'm giving you like a personal guided tour through the history of the Marvel Universe. Um, so it's got like sort of the classics. It's hitting a lot of familiar notes, but it's kind of like through my personal lens. And to me, those are like the two elements of the sort of grand design thing. Sort of what's in common between my grand design and then Ed's X-Men is, on the one hand, it's this almost like encyclopedic work where it's got like so much content, so many stories, so many characters in like a relatively small number of pages, like much more much more going on than like your typical Marvel or DC comic. But then you also have sort of like the artist's personal touch, like it's like very personal and very has like a strong point of view and is sort of like idiosyncratic and unique. So it's kind of those two things together, kind of like a universal and like an extremely specific.
Yeah, Ed's his X-Men Grand Design was incredible. So if you ever see him or run into him in Pittsburgh, please do give him a high five and tell him that's from me. But what was
Oh,
the
I'll let him know. Okay, yeah, for sure.
but what was the process like then to create Fantastic Four Grand Design? I assume that every Fantastic Four comic book is like a Lego block, right? And you can build anything with those Legos. So what is the architectural process for the book like?
Well, I mean, for me, the biggest part was kind of finding a window in. Like, how do I approach this? How do I get started? What's the angle? And so I kind of came up with the idea that like the history of the Fantastic Four is the history of the Marvel universe. It's sort of like the first Marvel age book. Like, of course, there's Captain America and Namor and stuff in the 30s and 40s, but what we think of as the Marvel age kind of starts with Fantastic Four, and so many characters premiered there. Like, there's so many characters that we think of as sort of being their own thing, like Silver Surfer, Galactus, Black Panther, the Inhumans, but they actually like originated as Fantastic Four, villains actually, like where it's like, okay, they're the bad guys for like maybe one issue or two issues, and then the Fantastic Four kind of get to know their deeper story. So I thought like, okay, anybody who premiered in Fantastic Four, that's fair game. So it kind of gave me this broad canvas to work with. And then, it's kind of like looking at Galactus's story and Galactus's origin story in the Silver Surfer. And I just saw all these echoes with the Fantastic Four's story. So I kind of like saw it as maybe this like, this resonant myth cycle that keeps, getting repeated through the Marvel universe. So that's kind of my window in. And then I got like just very personal with like each of the characters. I tried to like, figure out like what's their life, each of the four, and then, get them on their road, from where each one of them started, and then how they sort of end up together. And just like really closely reading the old comics and trying to look at them with like a new eye or a new lens, because these are comics that have been told and retold again and again. These stories, they're extremely familiar to me and to a lot of people. And so I was trying to look at them as if they were just coming out today and, what they seemed like. And Fantastic Four, if you read those older stories, we don't really know them very well yet. So there's kind of like, they kind of have like an edge. They're like a little bit dangerous and a little bit scary, and you're not quite sure, where you stand with them. Like in the early issues, they steal the rocket that they go up in. They're sort of outlaws. And so I was trying to think of a way of like, how you get from there to like these, these sort of, celebrities that they become later on in the story.
I know Ed worked on X-Men and you worked on Fantastic Four, but isn't it astonishing that like these creators were able to create this mythology and this continuity, knowing that like how haphazard it was back then? Like you said, we'll just throw in Black Panther in this episode, and okay, now he's a bad guy. In the next episode or next issue, he's a good guy. Like, it's astonishing that, like, considering the pitch process now and how people have to have like whole arcs or whole ideas when they pitch to an editor or talk to an editor to do something, it's incredible that these guys like Lee and Kirby and Ditko and others were able to create this mythology that lasts and has resonance to this day.
Yeah, I mean, I think they had the skills. Each one of them was an industry veteran. Each one had done, and literally a veteran too, but they each done more than their fair share of comics before they started doing these works. So they had all the skills in place, and then they also had like just enough like creative ambition. They really like wanted to do something big and do something new and kind of tell like a story worth telling. But then they were kind of loose too. Like they weren't overly serious about it either. They were just kind of having fun. And I feel like that's like a real sweet spot. Like you kind of have to have those three elements to be able to make something really great. If you're too serious and too precious, you can kind of like strangle the life out of something.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're kind of like a little bit loose and kind of have all those kind of skills to fall back on, you can make something amazing. And just to not be self-conscious at all. And I think they weren't. I think they weren't self-conscious. They were, they had sort of like a confidence and a looseness and almost like here goes nothing. Like okay, we might get shut down tomorrow, so let's just do our thing.
Yeah, so is that kind of fun approach something you mimic as well? That kind of looseness, like we've been talking about Grand Design, which is Fantastic Four. You've done Transformers versus G.I. Joe. You've done GoBots. People have deep connections with these characters or previous comic book runs. Because I would imagine that there'd be a little bit of trepidation to take this stuff on. Because if you don't get it, then people will be upset or cranky or whatever it may be. But I guess if you're approaching it kind of loose, like you said, and like you understand the value of what you're doing, but you want to have some fun with it, which shows up in a lot of your work, it would make it a lot more kind of acceptable, I guess, and a lot more fun for people. Fun is contagious.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. Like if the creators of these works are having fun, then there's a pretty good chance the audience will too. That's a balance I try to strike. Like I that's kind of the zone I want to get in, and sometimes it's hard, sometimes it's easy. I find that, like, once you get over the sort of fear of like a blank page, like once you get started, a certain part of your brain shuts off, and then things just start rolling, and then it is easier to get into it. It's kind of like at its most intimidating, like before you really dive in, but once you jump in, it kind of takes on its own momentum.
Mm-hmm. So sticking with Jack Kirby and momentum, how did Phantom of the Attic, eHarmony connect you with Jack Kirby's work?
Yeah, I mean, I was, like a freshman in college, and I just moved to Pittsburgh, and, I was into comics, and that was the local comic shop. That was the college, that was, it was right off campus and walking distance. And yeah, I was just like checking out all their stuff. And like Jeff, the guy who runs it, he's like a huge Jack Kirby fan. And they had sort of like a little, like a little Kirby corner, like a little rack, and it had, the Art of Jack Kirby book. It had, some Jack Kirby collectors and stuff. And so I was just kind of looking at that, and I sort of, heard the name Jack Kirby. I had, somewhat of an acquaintance with like his work, but I didn't understand just how deep it went and how far it went, and that was kind of like my introduction of like, okay, this guy Jack Kirby, this is somebody like really important, and has done some like really amazing work, and like I got to pay attention, because like just flipping through like the Art of Jack Kirby book, it's like, oh, like I can't believe one person did all this stuff. It had like stuff from like the 30s and 40s, and then the 50s, 60s, the 70s, and like the 70s stuff really jumped out at me, because it looked like nothing I'd ever seen before. Like I was kind of shocked that like that something so bold and visionary like escapes my notice.
Yeah, did it help that you were taking film classes at the same time as well? Just because, like, you see this visual style.
Yeah,
Kirby's style is completely,
yeah,
like, it explodes off the page. It's very cinematic.
yeah. It really is. He loved the movies. He was part of that generation that spent his afternoons at the movies. You just sort of, go there, pay your ticket price, and just, hang out for the rest of the day. And, you think about the era, he's like starting off in kind of like the silent era, seeing, those like early Cecil B. DeMille movies, like the original Ten Commandments, like before the remake with Charlton Heston, where it's just, all these like insane like visuals, or like like some of like the German expressionist films and stuff. And when you go back and watch some of these like silent era movies, you do see like a lot of like the Kirby DNA in there. There are a lot of these stories of like gods and monsters, angels and demons, cataclysms, and he would have been very young at this point, so it probably like imprinted really strongly on him, and he'd like sort of like retell these stories up until like the end of his career.
Extending that thread, then, this brings us to your graphic novel biography of Jack Kirby, which is called Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics. This is an obvious question, and considering our conversation and considering your influences, so you can just roll your eyes and just kind of answer it. But why Jack Kirby and not like Steve Ditko or Gardner Fox or some other overlooked and underappreciated old-timey comic book superstar? There's a lot that have never gotten their due. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah, and all of them are overdue. It's just, I mean, Kirby, first and foremost, like his work speaks to me personally. Like I had a really strong connection with his work, and became obsessed with it. Quite honestly, and so there's that. And then I think he's also, beyond my personal connection, I think like I can't think of anyone else who had a bigger influence on like where we are now as in sort of like a pop culture sense than Kirby. Like I see his influence on everything. I mean, first of all, like the literal influence of all these characters and stories and worlds that he created that are for the past 20 years have like dominated film industry, but then I also see it in the influence in games, in stuff like Star Wars or Masters of the Universe, or things that he didn't directly work on, but are obviously influenced by him. Like it was those two things. But yeah, I mean, there's other people you mentioned, would be good candidates. I've been sort of like working on like a graphic biography of Otto Binder,
Okay.
who is like, I think is like somebody who is more overlooked than Kirby, had a huge influence. Like the 40s and 50s, the Captain Marvel comics that he wrote, like there was nothing bigger. It was huge, and then all that stuff just kind of disappeared, and he moved on. He sort of got out of the comics business. When comics had its like resurgence in the 60s, he wasn't really on the scene in any big way, so he didn't benefit from it the way that like Jack Kirby and Stan Lee and Steve Ditko did. And I think that might be part of why he is like so forgotten. Like if he had just kind of stayed in comics like one more decade,
Mm-hmm.
there might have been like more connective tissue. But just super interesting guy, really interesting story, and the stuff that he worked on after he like left comics is really interesting too.
Do you have an expected release date for that, or is that one just something you're kind of chipping away at slowly?
Yeah, it's something I'm just kind of working on. Similarly with like the Jack Kirby book. Like the Jack Kirby book really just started as like a comic I was kind of playing around with, trying out and posting on Instagram and stuff. And I mean, I did have ambitions towards, having it, released as like a book, which is pretty much how I feel about everything I work on. But the Otto Binder one is kind of at that stage. No release date or anything, but I'm kind of, putting the pieces together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you just put the tea bag in, but it's still got to steep a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, Ditko would be an interesting one. I would like to do a book about Ditko. I think the research process for a Ditko one would be a lot more difficult, and I would probably have to, like put on my journalist hat, like to a really large degree. Like I think I would have to, go around, talk to like, the family, his friends, like because with Kirby, there was a lot more like publicly accessible information because he had stayed connected to, comics fandom and sort of like Hollywood and stuff for the entirety of his life. Like he was very accessible, very approachable. So there's a lot of interviews. There's a lot on the record about Kirby, where Ditko, he was, a really big part of fandom and comics, kind of zine culture and stuff, and then disappeared off that radar and just not really heard from again and too much. And especially in terms of like biographical information, he was really loath to talk about himself personally. He liked to let his work speak for him, and if he did manage to get him like on the record about anything, he would usually just talk to you about Ayn Rand.
Mm-hmm.
And Randian philosophy, so you didn't really get too many insights into him personally.
Their art styles mirror their personalities, right? Kirby's is very big personality, very bombastic, like sure of himself. You know what I mean? And you kind of see that in the artwork.
Yeah.
And then Ditko is kind of like a lot more quiet, introspective, like withdrawn, very subtle, but still like there, like still a recognizable force. You know what I mean? Like when he's in the room.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they are more alike than they are different. Like I think if you're really like steeped in comics, you're like more tuned into their differences, but they do sort of come from the same school, and especially like when you go really far back with their work, like Ditko's earliest work and Kirby's earliest work, even though they were kind of like a decade apart in terms of like age and like when they entered the field, you see more alike than difference. But yeah, they definitely, as they matured and their styles matured, they kind of carved out their own little areas.
So you've used this phrase a couple of times, the connective tissue, and I don't know if this is a weird question or a dumb question, but when you're doing Fantastic Four Grand Design, which was about Kirby's work in Fantastic Four, but it was also about comic book continuity. So things get introduced in general comic book continuity, and you don't know if it's going to have an impact or not. You kind of alluded to this too, right? Like
Yeah.
they were just kind of making up stuff, and like
Hmm.
you don't realize like something like the Ultimate
Yeah.
Nullifier will still be hanging around or still be having an influence in Fantastic
Right.
Four all these decades later. But when you study Jack Kirby's life, his real life, can you see a similar continuity, or can you see a grand design that kind of runs through it?
Yeah. I mean, that was a challenge too. I mean, like the thing that kind of works to your benefit when you're working on, nonfiction as opposed to fiction is like when you're doing fiction, you are expected to tie everything up and make, everything pay off and all the little, twists and turns, add up to something and have resonance. When you are doing nonfiction, you kind of, tell the story as it is. And, if there are unresolved things, that's okay because that's how life goes, and you just sort of let the story, like let the fact tell the story. There's less of you forcing like your will on it or some kind of order to it, which I think benefits the work. I did like with the Fantastic Four, I did try to approach it a little more like a biographical work and kind of like a almost like a documentary, So I tried to like bring some of that approach that I was doing with Black Widow. I worked on those two projects concurrently, so I was sort of conscious of and okay with this biographical approach influencing this like fictional work I was doing, and kind of let it breathe a little. And since it like the 2004 thing was such a big story, it worked to my benefit to sort of allow there to be certain gaps that the reader gets to fill in.
Yeah, so when you draw Kirby in the graphic novel, The Epic Life of the King of Comics, when you draw Kirby, you draw him with these like big eyes. Visually, he's really distinct from all the
Mm-hmm.
other characters in the graphic novel.
Mm-hmm.
So for each project, are you kind of developing a premeditated visual style, or is that something that just kind of naturally comes out, or like unconsciously comes out as you kind of work on the project?
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the Jack Kirby book, that emerged organically. It was just in the process of doing this, page after page, it kind of started going in that direction, and I was thinking like, okay, do I fight this? Do I go with this? And like I found that like it's it's hard to kind of like rationally explain like why that, but it just I found that it like just really worked. Like
It did,
it
yeah.
it like it read really well, and it worked in a way that like it didn't work without that, like and so I went back, there were a couple of pages I went back and like kind of brought into that kind of made that sort of cartoons Kirby, that kind of like stylized Kirby, and yeah, they just came alive, and I couldn't see doing the book another way. Like it was almost like if I do Kirby in like a semi-realistic or a photorealistic way, it almost seems like he was like a secondary character in his own life,
Mm-hmm.
where it was like this really like brought the focus on him and kind of brought you like into his skin and it took you on his journey and like I understand how that works in like a like in a theoretical way, just from studying like Scott McCloud and Marshall McLuhan. It's like I understand like it makes you both how that works, but just there was like a poetry to it. It's really and again like when you're creating something, sometimes you have to like decide whether or not to like listen to that voice that's kind of telling you to do something that you weren't you weren't expecting, and you're not sure how it's gonna play out. But I think that's one of the benefits of working on something that's kind of like a self-guided project, like the Jack Kirby, where it was like I was really creating it, for myself. And again, I tried to bring some of that to the Fantastic Four brand design. I tried to bring like that independent spirit of like I'm doing this comic for me. If you like it, fine. But like I'm going where my imagination is taking me, and I'd like you to come along with me, but I got to do it this way.
Yeah, that's why I like the big eyes that you drew, the way we drew Kirby, because it represented to me like the imagination. Because that guy saw so much. When you look at the breadth of his work, it's like that's astonishing. Like from the Fantastic Four to New Gods to like you name it, like that's an incredible amount of imagination.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about like an artist or cartoonist, like we think about the hand, the hands, and in that book, his hand is important, and the pencil and all that. But I mean, the eye is really that's the main thing. That's what that's when we're talking about like a director or something. We talk about their eye, the eye,
Yeah.
and then talk about Cody as a visionary. So like the eyes are just like really important.
Because we're talking about Kirby's like staggering output in his work, you're somebody who doesn't do traditional monthly comic books. I know you did like Transformers versus GI Joe, for example, but
Yeah,
generally you kind of do a lot of like projects. So, are you
yeah,
seeking kind of like stories, or are you seeking like properties? I guess for lack of a better term, right? Because Fantastic Four, GI Joe, GoBots were all properties. Even
yeah.
Kirby, to a certain extent, just because he's
Mm-hmm.
involved and enmeshed in that Marvel mythology. So, are you seeking stories, or are you seeking properties?
Well, I think the difference, just like the system, like the industry as it exists now, as opposed to how it existed then, like that, it made sense back then to like, get on a thing and just keep going with it and try to make it like last as long as possible, from month to month. And that does, still exist, to some degree today, but it's not, it's not the dominant form, and it's not, it seems like that way of doing things is kind of being phased out. So I mean, it's just it's just a natural consequence of me working in the era I work in. Like I'm able to make a career going from project to project and creating sort of works with a beginning, middle, and end. Like that was always really important to me, and that's like a luxury I've had that Cody actually didn't have.
Mm-hmm.
So many of Cody's stuff, like the majority of his work, are these kind of stories that don't really get an ending. Occasionally he got to do it, and when he did get to make an ending, it was very special. But he didn't get to do it that often. Usually his stuff would either get canceled, unresolved, or he'd move on to somewhere else, and somebody else would take over and continue his story. And some of those stories are still going on to this day. 70, 80, years later.
Yeah. So when you talk about Kirby's life like that he didn't always get to finish his work, or that other people would pick up on it, like, is Kirby, like you said, just a product of his time, like those two Superman creators who signed away their rights when obviously they didn't realize they were making $1 billion project? There was no way to even know that. Or do you view Kirby as like a cautionary tale, or like having written this book now, this graphic novel? How do you view Jack Kirby?
I mean, first and foremost, I view him like as an inspiration, as somebody to emulate, somebody who like you know knew what to do, was kind of doing the right thing. And there is the cautionary tale aspect to it. I do think of him when I'm making a deal or but like I don't see how he could have really done things too much differently back then. Short of having a time machine, like he did the best he could with the information as it as it was back then. Like just the understanding of like intellectual property, rights and creator rights, and what your rights are as a creator, as an author. Like those things just weren't very well understood. Um, that was information that was difficult to access, and there were I think there were some people who almost like through instinct and intuition were kind of shark-like and knew how to like you had this very general sense of how to take advantage of like a young creator, and were able to do so. And then some people had sort of like an instinct that allowed them, that led them to make like the right decision doing it. But I don't. A lot of the intellectual property stuff is like still being just signed his life away happily so that he could be all alone in his comics. Like he did hit the pavement, and he did try to get best deals that he could, but he was making the best of just kind of like a bad situation, the early days of comics. It was the Wild West, and it remains so. For decades, and even today, like there's still like ripple effects surface of that early comics culture and that early editorial culture.
Yeah, like I reference like because you did like Fantastic Four Grand Design, and I reference continuity, and it's hard at that point, like when Stan Lee and Ditko and Kirby and others are working on this stuff and creating Superman and Batman. They don't really have a sense of legacy or continuity. Like the community, really, the comic book fandom community has been built up at that point. Like it's hard to know like what you're doing is quote unquote important or will have a lasting effect. It's a lot like when Star Wars came out, right? Like you don't realize it's going to create this entire industry and it's going to affect generations. It's just like this would be a good movie, you know what I mean? And maybe I can go work on American Graffiti 2 after this or something. Like you don't realize what it is that you're making until all of a sudden it gets out there and it has this huge impact.
Yeah. I mean, like George Lucas, he had some grasp of possibility, but like in his wildest dreams, he wouldn't have like expected that. It was, he had his ups and downs, like his hits and his misses, before Star Wars. And I don't think it's possible to see Star Wars if you were thinking like, oh man, this thing is going to be huge. I'm going to get so rich off of it. I think that would be really debilitating. But like cartoonists and creative people, like I found there is kind of this like simultaneous, like overinflated ego, and then like super self-deprecating ego. It's kind of like you bounce back and forth between these two poles of like, oh yeah, I'm really onto something. This is great, and then oh, this is terrible. I'm worthless. Like that seems to be like a common trait, and so I could see Stan and Jack one moment feeling kind of grandiose, like, oh man, this stuff's so important, it's so great, and the next moment feeling like, oh, it's just pop, garbage for kids.
Yeah, that time period is so strange because they're basically creating the fandom, right? The characters and stuff that we all love, they were single-handedly creating them one by one, right? Fantastic Four and then X-Men and Spider-Man and like on and on and on. And it's like nowadays, it's like you said, I think you mentioned before, like that looseness, right? And that like you take it a little serious, like you do your work, but you don't take it super serious. And I think sometimes nowadays some creators do that where we're like, I'm gonna create this comic book and I'm gonna sell it to video games and I'm gonna sell it to movies, and you know what I mean? It's like this super focused, hyper intense like vision, and it's like then it comes out and like nobody cares.
Yeah, it can be very debilitating. It gets in your way. Like you really do have to cooking. Like when you're really in that creative zone, you do sort of disappear. And just the work is all that's there, and the longer you can stay in that zone, the better. And then eventually that kind of fades, and then you sort of come back to earth, and you're you again, and you're back to like trying to figure out what's out for dinner and stuff. But that's the thing I chase. Like I want to be in that zone, for as long as possible, and I have to.
So where can people find you online? See how you cycle. See how I did a GoBots pun there. Cycle through these different projects, as well as your Patreon. Where can people find you online to find out more about what you're up to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Twitter at Tom Scioli. I'm on Instagram at Tom_Scioli. I have my Patreon. Just search my name. I have a website, TomScioli.com and Amblog.com, which I haven't updated too frequently. I'd like to get back into that and do some more blogging on there. But yeah, and then there's the Total Recall Show channel on YouTube, where you can watch me and Matt talk about whatever's on our mind.
Yeah, we've gone now full circle, right? I opened with Total Recall, so
yeah.
We've gone full circle. So yeah, Fantastic Four Grand Design is obviously out now. and it's got a
Yeah,
collected kind of
it's out
edition.
now, still available.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
and we're doing like translations that like it's available in multiple languages and more all the time and of course yeah, the Jack Kirby the Epic Life of the King of Comics is still available too.
there you go. So thank you so much for hanging out. We covered quite a bit. We didn't get as much into the GoBots, but we did cover quite a bit of Kirby and old
Yeah,
school comics and new school comics as well. So thank you so much for hanging out.
you're welcome. Yeah, we'll have to get together again sometime and do like an all GoBot episode.
Okay, yeah, we'll do a part two, and it'll be all GoBots. So we'll have to schedule that for another time. Then we'll just leave that as a teaser. Then, yo, that was Tom Scioli, and I'm Sammy Younan. As I said, the two graphic novels are Fantastic Four: Grand Design and Jack Kirby: The Epic Life of the King of Comics. Pick up one or pick up both. Great reads, lots of sci-fi goodness, and comic book history lessons for the kids. If you want to know more about Jack Kirby, there is a podcast, and it's an adaptation of a play. Whoa, keeping it classy here. Where's my tuxedo t-shirt? Google King Kirby Podcast or search for the Broadway Podcast Network and King Kirby Podcast. I'll add it to the show notes, but Google also knows what I am talking about. It is highly recommended, and it brings Jack Kirby's life to, well, like, life. To conclude the proceedings, thank you, Jack Kirby, for your imagination, and thank you for your work. Realistically, we should, but we don't, have a better collective memory of the creators who have mightily contributed to our pop culture. We shouldn't just talk about Kobe or Michael Jordan. We should also acknowledge Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. We shouldn't just talk about Bendis or Jeff Johns, but we should also be able to recall Kirby and Gardner Fox and so many other greats. Who else in comics are we overlooking or failing to give them their due? Let me know. I am at My Pal Sammy for all three. My Pal Sammy for Facebook, Twitter, IG. Who are we overlooking or failing to give their due in comics? Thank you so much for listening and hanging out with me in a Netflix world. Jack Kirby, yo.